Good morning and welcome to Prevention Before CPS Involvement, Supporting Families at Risk. My name is Amy Corbin and I am a staff attorney with the Children's Commission. I'm very excited and pleased to introduce you to your two guest speakers today. First, you will hear from Sasha Rasco. She's our Associate Commissioner of Prevention and Early Intervention, part of the Department of Family and Protective Services. You will then hear from Judge Robin Sage. She is a judicial consultant with Casey Family Programs. We believe today you will learn a little bit more about the prevention efforts and services and why prevention is so important to go upstream before you get to child welfare. It is now my honor to turn it over to Ms. Rasco.
Thank you, Amy. I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you for your interest in prevention and attending this session. My job is to give you a sense of the Department of Family Protective Services work to travel upstream and prevent child abuse and neglect before it ever occurs. So I will just kind of get started by sharing a quote from our commissioner, who says one of the most important things we in the agency can do for Texas families is to proactively reach out to those that are struggling or stressed and offer them accessible lifelines that effectively address the challenges they face. And that's exactly what this branch of the department does, is both programmatically to offer services, but also to be the thinking arm of the agency about why exactly do we have these risk factors in child abuse occurring and what can we do earlier to prevent it. Next slide, please. So our framework is that we're promoting relational health or safe and stable and nurturing families in and communities that surround them in the work of the Prevention and Early Intervention Division. So we work to preserve the parent-child bond, both programmatically, and we're going to get to that, and through various community building strategies. We have the opportunity to elevate and strengthen family preservation work. So we also want to be the voice and include the lived experience voice of families that are working hard to be strong families and to promote the idea that children do best first and foremost with their families. And then we work to partner, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how child abuse and neglect prevention is a lot more than just parenting support and programs. It's about a healthy fabric of a variety of protective factors for families. Next slide. So a few different frameworks. If you're not oriented to sort of prevention speak, I'm going to spend a minute on the theoretical here. One way we talk about prevention is what is known as a public health framework, and kind of the same approach that you would take to preventing heart disease or diabetes. You have what is called, and you might have heard these terms before, primary prevention. So in child maltreatment, that is everyday family and community supports, schools, roads, jobs, healthcare, families functioning, extended neighbors functioning together. And that's akin to the type of heart disease prevention that you would find accessible and directed at everyone, like healthy nutrition, healthy exercise, health screenings just to monitor for risk factors. Then you move in the child maltreatment prevention space into what we call secondary prevention. And that's about addressing risk factors when they start to crop up. That can mean a family member with a mental health struggle. That can mean a job disruption or a trauma to the family. And that's where we provide counseling, mental health services, substance abuse services, home visiting programs, all to try to stabilize a family at risk. That's, of course, akin to getting treatment being prescribed drugs for cholesterol or prescribed health regimen for getting your heart healthy after you've already exhibited some of those risk factors. And then lastly, there's what we call tertiary prevention. That's about that's the traditional child protective services work where abuse and neglect has already occurred, but there's room to either stabilize the family and preserve the family, or, last case scenario, remove the child while we work with the family or seek a more safe and stable permanent place for that child. But we're still working to mitigate the impact and repair either the family system or the child's trauma and prevent any future abuse or neglect down the road. That, of course, is akin to sort of getting surgery after a heart attack and rehabilitating and trying to get stronger and prevent further heart disease. So that's one way of thinking about prevention. And you might hear that a lot: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Another analogy that we use conceptually on the next slide is the river analogy, and Amy referenced moving upstream. In this picture, you see folks closer to the frame, downstream, rescuing children from drowning or from the river. It's critical, important work. But the idea is to maybe move a little bit further upstream, figure out why families or children are falling in, and prevent them from falling in and drowning in the first place. That would be the work of prevention, to try to reduce those risk factors and prevent the event from ever occurring. That's another framework that's often used to talk about prevention. And then over the years, we've been actively scaling programs in this work for about 8 years in the agency, starting with Judge John Sasha when he was our commissioner. And we're now at this place where we realize, obviously, the breadth of the prevention work is beyond the programs just that we fund. It really is a healthy community. And we've kind of come together with a lot of our stakeholders and cast this newer, more expansive framework that recognizes all families need a variety of supports. This isn't about targeting, at-risk or troubled families. We all need and benefit from, in parenting our children, schools and media and healthcare and houses of faith and a court system, et cetera. So we want to recognize everyone is accessing support. It's just sort of the labels we put on it. And in the second frame, you can see that families then have either, again, traumas, disruptions, developmental events that strike, where they do need these safety net programs to help them get back on track, continue to parent healthfully, not disrupt their child's development, housing programs, food banks, mental health treatment, et cetera. So that's and all of those things are preventative when families can access them early and easily. The third piece of that, and something we also try to fund, is the connectivity, the connective tissue at the community level between those types of supports. So we're not placing the burden solely on the family, who's probably already under stress, to navigate a variety of different programs, but that we try to, in the community, instill either one-stop shopping or family navigation, and or cross-sector collective impact towards all achieving a similar positive outcomes for kids and families. So that's just another framework we've in recognizing, while the parenting programs we fund that I'm going to talk about are fantastic, and the parent-child relationship and that secure bond is incredibly protective, because that's the first piece, right? If you really care about your kid, you're going to figure out, and you have the capacity yourself to connect and have that secure attachment and manage stress and all those things, then the rest of it will most likely kind of sort itself out. But so the parenting work is really important, but child abuse and neglect prevention is so much more multifaceted than that. And so many other players should take a part in owning child abuse and neglect prevention and their effort in it. So on the next slide, I'll just kind of get back to sort of more of the concrete work we do, kind of out of the theoretical now. And now this is what we are doing actively. We have around $107 million of state and federal funding that we grant to over 160 community-based organizations. The PEI division does no direct work with families. So we don't have workers. We're not FBSS. We're not family preservation workers. We are really grant funding programming at the community level that is pretty blind to child protective involvement. In fact, there's a statute that we can't even require the name of the agency on front-facing paperwork. We have a completely separate database. All engagement is voluntary. So it's a community-based, voluntary set of services, not attached to child protection at all, other than that we share the same agency house. And we served a little over 60,000 youth and families on any given year. We do track outcomes, our home visiting work, which is really parent educators that visit the homes of families with children under 5, infants and toddlers and preschoolers. We have long-term engagement. We have increased rates of breastfeeding, which the data shows actually very protective. And we also have clients engaging a high rate of self-sufficiency after their home visiting programs. More broadly speaking, on the next slide, we are able to match our client data to not identifiably, but we match that, are able to determine the percentage of families that enter the child welfare system. So we can say with certainty that 94% of our families remain outside of CPS even 3 years out. It's much during service, it's about 99%, and then a year out, we track a year out, 2 years out, and 3 years out, our ability to, or our success at diverting families from child protection. We do the same with our youth mentoring programs, and and the juvenile justice system, because we're also statutorily directed to do juvenile justice prevention work. And 99% of our youth are not adjudicated in the juvenile justice system after going through one of our many youth or positive youth programming. And then we do a pre and post survey too of families. We have a whole framework of identifying protective factors in the family, and 90% of our families do show an increase of at least one protective factor after services. So we are tracking effectiveness, and we are using for the most part, about 85% of our programming is evidence-based. So we also have that reassurance too, that most of the programming has been through randomized controlled trials. So just just to help conceptualize, if you're still trying to wonder what are these programs? I don't understand. And that's and I usually have that when I get to these presentations. I just give a quick highlight of a couple of them. You might have heard of our Family and Youth Success Program. This was known for the longest time as our STAR program, or Services to At-Risk Youth. We renamed it based on family and client input to be our Family and Youth Success Program. It's really for every kind of garden variety parenting struggles, kids not wanting to go to school, getting in trouble, and it allows either the youth on their own, but hopefully also the parents, or the parents and the youth together, to come in for parent education and support to get through a pretty specific goal. We have about $24 million serving all 254 counties should have access to these services through 28 different granted community-based organizations. We serve a little over 20,000 youth. And on the next slide, you can see a map. And this is all available on our website, but just for if you can quickly look, you may not be able to see it on your slide. You can see the provider in your community, and you might know them really just as that organization, and that's okay too. Like, oh yeah, no, I use that counseling program at wherever, fill in the blank. That's probably funded by this Family and Youth Success Program. And then just as another way of example, this is more of a grant. We give out a little over 23 million for community level grants to take a community designed approach to reducing abuse and neglect with our children under 5. They represent 85% of our child abuse and neglect fatalities. So it's a big investment, again, starting with Commissioner Sasha to invest earlier to prevent those fatalities. So we have 27 different grantees doing extremely innovative things, from postpartum depression screening to teen parent navigators in high schools, all trying to connect families with very young children earlier to services. Those are our HOPES grants. You can see the map on the next slide. We also have programs for military or service members, vets, reserves, guards. We've got fatherhood programs. We've got a lot of other programs, and we have all their maps are available too on our website. But I just wanted to highlight those are two of our largest. We have a website we've just redesigned with parent voice called Get Parenting Tips, that has a variety of age-appropriate advice for parents, all trying to normalize parenting stress and help and destigmatize how hard it is to parent. And we have some social media activity to promote the website and promote the types of advice we want for parents. This would be in that primary prevention space. And we also want families to then find the services that we fund. So that's also our other secondary goal in having this type of website. We use this a lot and had a lot of traffic during COVID when families were pretty isolated at home. And we really recognized the stress parents were under and gave them a lot of tips for how to kind of manage their own stress and keep their kids occupied and happy. On the next slide, it's just a glimpse of some of the types of more in-depth advice. What parents told us is they don't want some of these like 8 bullet point surface level stuff. They want kind of real talk from real parents and experts that gets a little bit more into the like, no, really, for real, how do you deal with this situation? Because none of these things are easy. I have 2 kids. I wish I'd had this website up when they were younger. But then we also have on the next, I think you just see on the next slide, a bit of this is what it looks like to find those local programs. So you can, if you're working with clients, you can do a quick zip code search or county search and see what providers are available in your community. Some new, just a highlight of some even newer, exciting work that we're doing. On the next slide, you can see we've funded 5 family resource centers. This is a growing movement around the country to create, and Casey Family Programs and has also been a big help in helping us think this through and launch this work of giving neighborhoods and any family a place-based spot to go get support for parenting. So think of it like kind of like that public library, but they would also have a diaper bank and a place you could charge your phone while your child played and you look for a job, or maybe try to figure out how to find counseling services. And that has a welcoming, could support fatherhood groups at night. Family resource centers across the country, then some of them are very generalist in nature. Some of them are very specialized. There's some just for foster parents or adoptive parents. There's some for just pregnant, homeless families. They can be very niche and they can also be very broad, but all of them are about the idea that parenting is 2-generational work, and parents might need a lot of things very specific to the context of their kiddo. So we're excited to sort of pilot those. We just kind of got the funding rolling September 1 and are in the planning phase. So more to come on that. This is a quick glimpse, particularly for this audience, of some work Casey Family Programs is funding through the Harvard Government Policy Lab, and gives you a sense of some of the human-centered design or family-centered design work that we're trying to do. We looked at a lot. We looked at the data from our family preservation cases, our FBSS cases, and then traveled upstream in the data about 2 years prior, and by mostly talking to families and getting their story, and figured out 95% of families who experienced a removal had interacted with the criminal justice system prior to their case. So sort of we've done a lot of work in the prevention division of trying to embed our programming in the healthcare sector, thinking of, pediatrics, doctor's visits. That's where we're going to sort of get the attention of families or be able to connect them with these resources. And it hadn't even occurred to us to sort of figure out how to work in the criminal justice space. But to no surprise, families have had either DUIs or theft or minor possession. And the criminal justice system apparently doesn't really attend to the fact that folks are parents, and understandably doesn't really want to know or have that kind of invade that part of the parent's life or put them at risk for losing their kids. So it's a tricky space, much like the family violence space, of trying to help folks with kids. But it's also a huge reality for these families. So we're spending some time they're piloting how to work with the Harris County Public Defender's Office, who has a holistic public defense approach, to see how they can talk to folks about whether or not they're parents and what they might need earlier, and get them into a prevention program earlier, as an alternative to hopefully avoiding down the road having child protection or removals. And then in the San Antonio area, they're just starting conversations about working with a prison chaplaincy about the same thing. Now we're talking a little bit more downstream because obviously we've got a family member already in prison, but as we know, we have a lot of families out there raising kids with a parent incarcerated. And so apparently the chaplain in this particular area is a very trusted resource. So we're always, it's to meet parents where they are. So how can we really connect families in their moments of crisis to earlier support? So just wanted to highlight that for this audience in particular. We haven't put anything out about this study yet, but it's been really, really interesting to learn how complicated it is for other systems to interact with the parenting part of someone's adult life, and not turn that into a punitive or scary thing, but into a helpful, supportive part of the work that might that would hopefully benefit the child down the road. Okay, and I think I mentioned in addition to the work we're doing on broader child maltreatment prevention, research, and programming, we also have a whole office that that reads every child abuse neglect fatality. So we also have a particular bent to prevention of fatalities, not just removals or not just child abuse or neglect. On the next slide, you just see one example of the work they've done to promote some of our biggest fatality areas, which is sleep-related fatalities for families of very young children. So that's really one of our predominant types of fatality. We do a lot of parent education there. It should be preventable, but it is a hard thing. It's a hard, very personal, private area of folks' lives to address how they put their babies to sleep and sleep with their infants. Car safety, we have a lot of vehicle fatalities and drownings. So that's just, those are gun safety, poisoning, and you see the others. And then we have a whole host of work we're doing with hospital-based work on prevention of abusive head trauma, which is another big physical abuse fatality work. And again, all of this it's not easy. Hospitals are difficult partners. They are very busy. It's hard to get parents' attention. They're not in the hospital long. They're very tired, but that's our job, is to try and keep finding these places to really connect with parents and get them the tools or the knowledge they need earlier. On the next slide, this is just reference again to the Harvard work. I think it got out of order somehow, but I will say on the second paragraph, if you can read it, in addition to the law enforcement pilot I mentioned, they're also have been doing work with FBSS about just how to make better referrals from those family preservation cases that help the parent engage and be successful in whatever services are being required in that FBSS case, whether it's court ordered or not. And that will become in handy, as I think, I know Judge Sage is going to talk about FBSS. So I think this will be some good foundational work for us to really boost those types of services for families that might be eligible under FFPSA. Next slide. So I think I'm at the tail end. One of I mentioned earlier, the public health framework. So I think everybody now is a amateur epidemiologist, right, after this pandemic. So we all know what epidemiology is. So we, in child abuse and neglect, we did partner with University of Texas's Population Health, and Casey Family Programs helped fund this work as well, to take an epidemiological approach to child maltreatment. And they took 5 years of child abuse and neglect data from our agency and then matched it in big data systems against a lot of other things that happen to be true in the family and in the community, to create these high corollaries and sort of a community risk, not an individual family or profile type risk, but where there were concentrations in the community, or where we could maybe anticipate concentrations of maltreatment in particular communities based on community level data. So then we would know where to invest our prevention resources, which are fairly limited, and or our outreach or strategies, et cetera. So I'm not going to go through all of this. It's really, all these maps are available online, but it's really fascinating, the types of correlations you see with SNAP usage or WIC usage, or fathers not being on birth certificates, or the types of jobs or unemployment rates. I mean, none of this I think should shock anybody, but it's helpful to know where there really is a much higher corollary. Apparently, not having a family member on SSI in your household, or having a community, really, it's not about the individual, but having a community with a high number of adults on SSI is a big community level indicator that there will be high maltreatment. That could say something about the surveillance and reporting rates too. We're not able to completely control for that. Having children enrolled in preschool is protective. So the higher rates of preschool enrollment, you kind of have a sense that you'll have a lower risk of maltreatment. But anyway, you can, just to give you a glimpse of, and here's a little bit more data about just maltreatment, just how maltreatment kind of looks in Texas at least as of our last fiscal year, which is out of 20 investigations, a rate of 2 of them resulted in removal, and 9 of them resulted in a confirmation. And then on the next slide, I think you can see this continuation of what has been a pretty stable theme of 65% of those allegations being neglect related, 20% physical abuse, and 15% sexual abuse. So again, just a little bit about the problem we're trying to solve. And then back to these maps, you can drill down to zip code levels by age. So the risk is mapped out for infants. It's different for infants, 1 to 4-year-olds, school agers, middle schoolers, and high schoolers. So that's how you can drill down to zip code and figure out where in your community you might have, or where at the zip code level you might have higher rates for each age. So those are there for you to use in case that is helpful, and or for community collaborative work. And then I think the only other thing that I have to share, yes, is just, again, please encourage you to connect to any of our PEI programs through our websites or any of our information's online if you have it. And the links, I think, are there for your use. So thank you for letting me. I know Judge Sage is really going to talk about the intersections with the judiciary much more, but for giving you a highlight of the work at the agency in prevention.
Thanks, Sasha. It's really good to know that there are these resources available for us to use, and that our state has pretty much invested itself in some prevention. So there's already a network there in place that helps provide services for our families to help keep them out of the system or to prevent them from returning to the system. I want to focus a little bit more directly on the legal system and why should the legal community move to prevention? When I first started hearing the term legal community and working in prevention, my thought was, why do we need to do that? We have our own lane. We know once a petition is filed, we get to work. We don't go upstream from that. Frankly, we thought that's Sasha's job and she's doing that, and we didn't need to do it. But when you really look at our system, what you realize quite bluntly is that what we're doing just is not working for our children and family in Texas. So as a legal community, we need to look at the system overall. If you'll switch to the next slide, yeah. Think about the way our whole child welfare system is designed here. And it's not just in Texas, it's pretty much universally this way across the nation. Our system is only a reactive system. In other words, a child actually has to be harmed or injured before we go and examine that, investigate, and intervene. But what if we could stop child abuse and neglect before it even happens? If we as a legal community could contribute to that, what a great thing that would be. But think about other systems. What if the airline system that you were flying in only looked at situations, incidents, or accidents after they happen? They didn't pay much attention to the safety early on. We wouldn't want to fly on those things. Or the medical system, where Sasha referred to the prevention kind of like a heart attack in the various stages. If we only looked at heart attacks and examined them after people died of a heart attack or had a heart attack, that would be crazy, and none of us would want to participate in the system. And yet that's exactly what we do in our child welfare system. So looking at the system overall in the United States, there's just over, as of this time last year, there was about 400,000 children in out-of-home care. That means either foster care or relative care here in the United States, 400,000. Now, just as taxpayers, so you understand what that's costing us, nearly $33 billion a year is spent on direct state and federal funds through the Social Security Act. So literally to pay to keep these kids in out-of-home care, we're spending $33 billion a year, or the equivalent of nearly $50,000 per child in the foster care system. Now, that doesn't even count indirect costs such as medical care, food stamps for those children, cash child welfare payments, and child care payments. And those are estimated to be up to $3 trillion. So even if you didn't have compassion for the families and children in the system, as a taxpayer, that would concern me that that's how much of our tax dollars are going towards that. But then let's look at what we know about kids who grow up in foster care. It wouldn't be so bad to spend that much money if we were having good outcomes for these kids. But look at what we found. Casey Family Programs that I work for did a study of their alumni several years ago, and they interviewed and examined the lives of children who had been out of the system for 5 years. So we're looking at 23 to 18-year-olds basically. And of those kids, nearly 40% had had at least one mental health diagnosis in the prior year. 44% of them had either had substance abuse or dependence during their lifetime. Less than half of them, 48%, had a high school diploma. And that's as opposed to the general population where it's right at 80 to 82% of kids have a high school diploma. So less than half. 58% of them have either born a child or fathered a child. And of those that have, right at 10% of those have had that child removed and placed in foster care. And even more telling, 68% of the males and 40% of the females have been arrested during that 5-year period since they left foster care. So clearly, we're not doing any favors for these children that we're raising in foster care and allowing to graduate or what we call age out. Their outcomes just simply aren't very good. But let's look specifically at Texas. And Texas has some kind of unique indicators that might even put us in a different ballpark than some of the other states. Looking at this graph, I hope you can read it, but 23% of the children under 5 in Texas live in poverty. That's a pretty significant amount. Of those children, of all the children in Texas, over 10% have no health insurance whatsoever. More than a third of the households in Texas, 35% there in that second column, are under 200% of the poverty level. And particularly relevant, I thought, to child welfare in that system is that in the third column on housing, that first block, if a mother is working, and 24% of these children that we're talking about live in single mother households, mothers working a minimum wage job to maintain and pay for a 2-bedroom home or apartment, she has to work 87 hours a week to maintain that. Now, clearly, there's no way that a mother can work 87 hours a week, safely and effectively raise her kids, and have the same benefit, have those children have the same benefits that we would hope for all our children. So Texas does have some unusual indicators. Let's go on down then to the next one. I think we could all agree that for families to thrive, there are certain basics that they have to have: safe and affordable housing, quality education, safety in public and in the workplace, healthy food. They need to have medical services and clean water, food, and air. And frankly, Sasha's prevention group can't give all those to all of the people living in poverty. Some of those things are going to require legal action to enforce those rights for parents. And that's where we come in as legal figures in this scenario. Let's go to the next slide. There's clearly a connection between poverty and the effects on child welfare. The income that you have within your family determines the likelihood that you're going to come to the attention of the child welfare system. And this is nationwide. The overall maltreatment incident rate for children in low-income families was nearly 6 times higher if you lived in a low-income family than if you didn't. And then that doesn't even particularly count the material hardships that lead to parent stress, the things like living in poverty, not having enough money that causes parent stress, hazards like inadequate housing or unsafe neighborhoods, places you're forced to live that could lead to not only unsafe things going on in your neighborhood, but exposure to toxic substances, garbage, lead paints, things like that. And that even creates more of a burden on poverty-laden families. So the chances of a family that has a low income coming to the attention of the child welfare is substantially greater. Now, not only that, but then moving to the next slide, we've got to, I think, in the day that we live in and what's going on otherwise nationally in our country, we have to look at racial justice and child welfare. We have all heard about policing and the dangers of policing and people of color. We've heard about law enforcement and even the number and percentages of prosecutions. We've not really begun to hear that much about this in the child welfare system, but let me show you that it is certainly present, and Texas needs to address it. So on this particular bar graph shows, for example, that at the different points in Texas where we make decisions about children and whether they go forward in the child welfare system or whether they're able to come out of the child welfare system, just as an example, you'll see on the first one on the left that 12% of the Black or African-American, of the general population is Black or African-American. That's that navy colored thing. And you see that as that goes across through the child welfare system and decisions are made all along the way, that more and more or higher and higher percentages of Black and African-American children are included in the system, so that by the time you get over to the last two bar graphs where children that have been in the system for more than 2 years or children that actually just age out of the system, they're at 2 times the level that they are in the general population. So Texas not only is making decisions as a state that create disparities in the racial makeup of children in foster care, but we continue that across the entire system. Let's look at how that happens, starting with the next slide. All right, the bar graphs that are in the gray, those are the national rates that entry is occurring. So this one looks specifically at entries into the child welfare system. And you'll see that with the red, sort of reddish and the lime green bars that go across there, they're fairly close to the national average. But the two above, which is nearly twice the rate of the national average, are those that represent Black or African-American children and the multiracial children. And they are coming into our system here in Texas at nearly twice the average rate, or twice the national rate. The next slide shows children and how not only entry into the system, but staying there. So like after 30 days, how many children are in the system? Well, you see the high percentage of Black and multiracial children as opposed to the Latino or white children. And by the way, I'm going to mention that don't concern yourself too much with the gold and the purple bars, simply because they're accurate, but there's so few numbers of American Indians and Pacific Islanders here in Texas that those numbers throw those bars off. And you'll see here in a minute where some of those gold bars go way up high, and that's simply because there's so few numbers there. So the next bar shows once we get a child into the system, are we achieving permanency for that child within 12 months? And this is one of the areas that you really want to be on the lower end of the graph, but you'll see that, on the higher end of the graph, but again, the Black and African-American children are at substantially lower rates. We're not getting permanency for them within 12 months, near as much as we are for Latino or white children. The next slide. Children who have been in the care of the department for more than 2 years. And again, see, this is where I was talking about the gold bar going way up. That may just be like 6 or 8 kids that throw that whole thing off. But the ones that involve Black, African-American, Latinx, multiracial, or white, there's enough numbers there that we can pretty much rely on those. And you'll see that again, children of Black or African-American descent and multiracial descent are still higher in the category of children who get into the system and stay there for longer than 2 years. The next slide shows those kids who age out of care. And I think those of you who have been involved with the child welfare system for several years would have to agree with me that generally, I think we can say that we have failed a child if they end up aging out without a permanent connection to family or kin or somebody, another significant adult in their life. And these are the children, again, children of color that are aging out at substantially higher rates. So I think when it comes to racial justice, that's a question that we in Texas need to address. And my thinking is, and my suggestion would be that if we could keep these children, all of them, out of the system, keep them from ever entering the system, we've dealt with some of these racial tensions and problems that we're seeing as indicated by the graphs. And perhaps we can address that indirectly by simply keeping children out of the system. So the next slide, again, I go back to the question of why do we as legal parties need to be involving ourselves in prevention? And that is to keep families from being separated, the money that we're spending, the poor outcomes for children, and the racial disparities and inequalities all would tell us that we as legal people and entities need to begin to look at the prevention system. The next slide. I included this simply because it's somebody that's smarter than me saying that lawyers need to play a role in keeping children with their families, and that there's still an enormous and untapped area within the child welfare community that lawyers can join in that conversation about how to invest more resources up front to keep children safely at home. And that it comes from Vivek Sankaran at the University of Michigan Law School. I'm going to tell you about a project that he led in just a few minutes. So keep that in mind, and let's move to the next slide. So as lawyers, what tools do we have? Now, we heard about some of the tools from Sasha that we can access through her prevention and early intervention department, but what do we as lawyers have to work with? The next slide shows us that back in December of 2018, a wide sweeping law was passed and signed into law by President Trump at the time that fundamentally changes our system. Now, in Texas, we haven't heard a lot about this simply because the Family First Prevention Services Act, or you may hear me refer to it simply as Families First, was set up so that each state could implement it when they were ready to between October of 2019 and October of 2021. So Texas, because we were involved in lots of other things, including legislative sessions, class action lawsuits, we deferred as a state to implement Family First in October of 2021. So we're just now getting to the point of actually implementing Families First and making some of the wide sweeping changes that it includes. The next slide shows kind of the difference between those. Up to now, or pre-2018, in order to serve a child, we pretty much had to remove that child from their family, from their parents, and put that child in foster care. And that's where most of our dollars went, was for foster care and for services for that child that had been removed from their homes and from their parents. Under Families First, the completely different philosophy is, let's try to save the families. And so there's more money for prevention that we can now access that we didn't have access to before. Before, the services were for the child and only for the child. And if we got services for the parents, it was generally through Medicaid or something like that. But now there's prevention money for both parents and the child. Before, there was an income test to qualify. You probably remember that a family had to meet like the 1994 poverty test in order to qualify for foster care and services. Now there's no income test. A family that is well off can actually qualify for these prevention dollars as long as the state of Texas certifies that they are a candidate for foster care. In other words, they are likely to be removed from their home and come into the child welfare system unless they get these services. So there's no income test. We have help for kinship. We've been encouraging kin folks and relatives to come forth and take placement of these children, but that has proved very difficult for many of these families. And so now we have federal dollars that are funding kinship navigators to help these kin folks get through the system and figure out and how to be a placement for the child. In the past, we had no money for children who were placed with a parent in a residential treatment facility. For example, if a mother went to a substance abuse treatment facility and that facility had the capacity to have the mother bring her children with her, she could, but she got no help, no financial assistance, and no federal foster care dollars were used to pay for that. Now that mother could go in and get treatment for up to 12 months for a placement like that. And that actually began in October of 2018. So you can see that the effect of Families First could be pretty substantial once the state of Texas begins implementing and getting some of these pieces under their belt. The next slide. I wanted to know when I first started looking at this, just how many of these kids that would actually touch. And in my thinking, probably we couldn't avoid removing children who were, severely physically abused or sexually abused. But if you look at the reasons for children entering foster care, and these don't add up to 100% because the caseworkers can mark more than one. So in lots of cases, it's 92% of the cases where children were removed from their parents involved neglect, or parental substance abuse at 66%, inadequate housing. Those are things that I think we truly could address here in Texas by some of this prevention dollars, attention, and services. And so I'm really hopeful that Families First might be something that we could really make a dent in the number of children entering into our foster care system. Next slide. Again, just to make the point, I wanted to quote someone smarter than I am, and Jay Rajaram has been working with the Legal Services Corporation in New Jersey. And she points out something that should be obvious to all of us, but in the field, I'm not sure we always see that. And basically, she's saying that poverty is not a reason to remove a child, that we've got to move upstream, be a source of support and strengthen the family, and avoid correlating poverty-related issues with abuse and neglect. Poverty-related issues is not necessarily dangerous or risk-inducing, and it's not a reason to remove a child from their parents. And I thought that was a good quote, and she made a good point with that. Our next slide. So what we're seeing is across the country, there are some pre-petition legal services that are kind of popping up. And some of the characteristics of those legal services are, so a lot of them come from referrals from the Child Protection Agency, which seems kind of opposite of what you would expect to me. But what happens is an investigator gets hold of a family to investigate, and they realize that this family needs some legal services that would solve their problems. And so they're actually making referrals to help keep these families out. We see lots of multidisciplinary team staffing models. And I'll go over a couple of these in more detail in just a minute. There's a range of legal expertise. Not all these problems require lawyers. Sometimes paralegals are able to solve the problems and you don't need that. But there's a big use of parent partners, mentors, and advocates in this. And then these various projects get funding from multiple sources, some public, some private, some claiming the Title IV reimbursement for legal representation of children and parents that is now available to us. So the next slide just kind of outlines what attorneys and judges might do under Families First. And one of the main things that I think it's important for us as a legal community, whether we do anything further along the way of service or not, is help our agency develop what services are available in our community. For example, if you have 6 cases in a row of mothers needing alcohol abuse treatment, and there's absolutely no alcohol abuse treatment in your county, then clearly you need to go to your agency and talk to them about, hey, this is very important, this is what we need. And because we have a vantage point as legal operators in the community, we see what's needed, what would help our community and our parents, and we have the responsibility, I think, to make that known and let the agency begin working on that. There are opportunities throughout Texas for your county to claim this 4E funding for reimbursement of legal representation of parents and children. That's only come about within the last couple of years, and a few counties have started claiming it, but not many. And those who have most effectively, I think, are figuring out that they need to they need to reinvest that money in high quality legal representation for these families. So those are some of the opportunities, along with the others that, including racial equity and diversion and inclusion work, that I think we need as legal operators to begin to invest in. The next slide. Okay, I want to go a little bit more detailed into some of these things that I think we'll be seeing as these various prevention or legal prevention projects creep up around the nation. One of the things that we've learned, I think, through lots of research in the last few years is that the most effective interventions that we can make in the child welfare system are those where parents with lived experience are involved in the design and creation of projects and plans for building stronger families. In the past, I think a lot of us, just by nature of circumstance, have viewed our work, or at least the families see our work, as the system versus the family. All of us as legal people, as child welfare agents, caseworkers, CASAs, are all viewed by the families as part of the system. And that's no longer the way that we want to view that. Some counties that I observed over the last few years actually kind of had the attitude that if this family did something so bad that their children got removed, they just really didn't deserve much of our time, attention, or services. And we made them prove to us that they cared enough about their child to work the service plan we gave them. I think that attitude has begun to change, and the more we involve birth families in the design of our projects and understand about where birth families are coming from, the more effective our system will be. So on the next slide, another avenue that we're beginning to see that's really, I think, fruitful for study is that in New York last year, a study came out where instead of appointing like a single attorney to represent a family once a petition was filed, they used law offices where there was a team that was comprised of an attorney, a social worker, sometimes a paralegal, and a parent advocate, who to all work together as a team to represent that. This study out of New York City proved that it not only provided better representation as measured by client satisfaction surveys, the families got to permanency quicker, and there were better outcomes. And frankly, it cost the same or less than this single attorney model. So I think as these models begin to creep up, we're going to see more and more multidisciplinary team representation across the state of Texas. In fact, our Texas Children's Commission just came out with a study or a report that indicated that multidisciplinary team representation was something that we should be exploring here in the state of Texas. So don't be surprised when you see that come up. And finally, the next slide talks about a program that's very popular in other areas of the country, but hasn't been used just very much in Texas yet. That is involving parent advocates. Now, they call them different things. Some models call them friends, parent partners, others call them mentors, others call them advocates, and there's a little bit different connotation, but the general idea is that parents get help. Parents who are entering the system as new parents get help, and they are assigned a parent who has successfully navigated the system and been reunified with their children. So that can go as far as from the Texas Children's Commission has a guide for parents that just answers. It's just kind of here are your questions, here are the straightforward answers. Other jurisdictions actually have classes like Parenting 101, not how do you parent, but what are your rights as a parent as you go through a CPS case. And then even more evolved and more effective are some models one started in Washington State, and it's called Parents for Parents. It started in one county where a successful parent was appointed to walk alongside a new parent in the system. And they have found that that model was so successful in earlier reunifications, less cost to the state because of attorney's fees, number of hearings, and outcomes, that Washington State has now mandated that every county in the state have a Parents for Parents program. And they're doing that. That is a court affiliated one, so that when the parent shows up for court the first time, they're appointed a mentor, a parent mentor, and they work alongside that person and 10 classes with that person. Iowa has a similar model, but it's a little bit different. Theirs comes through the Child Welfare Agency. And in other words, their CPS pays for this parent model, and they assign somebody as soon as their case comes to practice, comes to the attention of CPS, and they appoint that person to walk alongside the new parent throughout the life of the case. And then there's various models that are coming up that are kind of hybrids of that, but some use parents strictly as advocates, where they work for the lawyer, and while they do have contact with the parent, they go to court and advocate. I would say much like a CASA does, but they advocate for the parents, and those models as well have proven to be effective. So those are just some of the things I think you'll be seeing over the next few years. The next slide. Let's go on, skip on. I wanted to give you some examples just to get you to start thinking about things that could be done in your community. One of the most successful law school clinics that we've seen in the last few years actually ran from 2009 to 2016, and then because of funding had to be cut. But this was at the University of Michigan Law School. So it used law students with some of their professors as the actual bar person, but they supervise their work like we do here in Texas, where you can get sort of a provisional law license as long as you're working under somebody. And so at this law school, they undertook thousands of cases and were successful. Now, they didn't work in CPS cases at all. What they did was take cases that had ancillary legal proceedings, such as eviction or employment or things like that needed resolving, and those kept the child out of the child welfare system. They were successful during that 7 or 8 year period, keeping 100% of the children they served out of the foster care system. And in 98% of the cases, they achieved their legal objectives, which might have been guardianship, eviction, stoppage, or things like that. So if you have a law school in your area, that's something worth studying. It's worth studying whether you have a law school or not. If you're interested in prevention, that's a great case in point. Now, the next one, which is called the First Clinic, that's in Seattle, Washington. And literally a few lawyers got together and were talking one day, and we're talking about how King County, Washington was removing so many children from brand new moms because the child or infant was born substance exposed. And apparently King County just almost automatically removed those kids. And these 3 lawyers were talking and said, that doesn't have to be the case. We could help these moms. And they got together, got some funding, and started this medical legal partnership now at the most prominent hospital there in Seattle, where impoverished babies are born. The hospital, with the mother's consent, notifies this partnership, and they start working with the mother even before she has birth, if possible, or if not new moms that have substance exposed babies. They get them services, they help them with material things, and they've kept 78% of the mothers that would otherwise have had their children removed from being removed. That's been a very successful program and worth studying. Now, the legal aid model in Iowa, I particularly included because I didn't want anybody saying my county can't do this, because if you're from a rural county in Iowa, you're from a rural county in Iowa. And what this Legal Services Corporation did was they got some public and private money, cobbled it together, and they've been doing civil legal work such as protective orders, public benefits, landlord-tenant issues, and family law modifications for the last, I think it's been since 2015. And they have actually been able to not only say that they've kept over 100 kids out of the child welfare system, but that their work is proving to bring economic gains for each dollar invested in the system. So that's been a very successful small county program. There's a couple other examples on the next slide. The Children's Law Center, which is a law firm in California that works with kids who are already in care, created a prevention type program for kids who become parents or youth who become pregnant because of sex trafficking or while they're in care. And they've been able to prevent many of those babies from coming into the care of the department by working with the parents who were already in care. And it's kind of a unique model there. I believe it's in Los Angeles, but you can find that under the Children's Law Center of California. The Legal Services Corporation of New Jersey is probably the most well-known because they've been working for many years to alleviate CPS investigations and bringing parents into custody. A couple of the tenets of their work require that they involve themselves within 24 hours of referral, and most of their referrals do come from CPS investigators. They report that they have about an average of about 6 hours turnaround on cases because so many of their cases can be solved with just a phone call. For example, a landlord is going to evict a family. They give them a call, say, we're Legal Services Corporation of New Jersey. How can we help? He says, well, really, all I need is documentation that they're legal and they can get that for them. Or they just need $250 as a deposit. And somehow Legal Services can put them in touch with organizations that might help them with that. And that's something that they've been doing for many years and very successfully. A final example, the Legal Services of Oklahoma was created as a part of a class action lawsuit settlement, but the department there, CPS, actually pays the legal fees on an hourly rate to serve families in divorces, guardianship, and housing issues. So these projects come about by a variety of ways. I read about one the other day that's in Georgia, and they actually send lawyers into some underserved schools like 2 days a week. There's lawyers that actually have hours in office at the school so that parents can run by when they pick up their kids or drop them off and talk to a lawyer for a few minutes and get some advice and then get referrals to more extensive legal services if they need. So my point is that these projects that involve prevention are cropping up around the country and that there's many ways that they can come about, but it's up to us as legal folks to do that. And I just want to encourage you as we close that these projects that I mentioned have helped thousands of people who were in poverty, and they started by one person or two or three people who had a heart to help those people and knew they weren't going to get any other help any other way. They grew up out of the grassroots. Some had legal services corporations behind them, but some were just people who wanted to help their clients. And I say this, that you can do in your community what nobody else can do, be it big or small. Just take your idea or your desire to help these people and begin to talk to some people. You'll find people that want to get on board with you and just take a first few steps to begin a project like this. And before long, we can all be doing prevention and keeping these families out of our child welfare system. And then finally, I just put our contact information on the last slide. So if you want to contact any of us, Amy, Sasha, or I can give you help finding any of these resources or connect you with folks that could help you get started down this road if you're interested. So thanks for joining us today. I think that's it, Amy.
Yes, thank you to all for joining us. We appreciate the time and attention that you've given. I think we could listen to Sasha and Judge Sage talk all day. They're so passionate, and please, like Judge Sage said, please take note of our email addresses. Reach out to any of us. We'll be more than happy to talk to you about prevention referral services. And I believe you should be given a copy of this PowerPoint, and the addresses where to find PEI resources or Casey information should be on there. So thank you so much, and you'll have a nice day.